computer. Good morning and welcome. And no one will know anything that we've talked about beforehand. But it's wonderful to see everybody here, and I'm glad that we're continuing on with our journey. As we talked about a little bit, the main thrust for bringing this course was to develop a basis and understanding of what Christian mysticism was, some of the early Christian mystics, to lay framework and groundwork for an understanding that, or perhaps a misunderstanding of mysticism as far as the Lutherans are concerned. So we're going to continue our initial study now. And because of the conversations that we had beforehand, this study will continue on for another couple of weeks, and we may be drawing a little bit closer to an understanding of mysticism for Lutherans. So this morning, precious, loving, and gracious God, as we are all joined here together today, we are eager to have you open up our hearts and our minds, to let your spirit walk amongst us so that we can learn everything that you would want us to learn about mysticism, about relationship with you, about your plan of salvation, and how this works within that plan, and how we can better be those disciples who follow in the footsteps of Jesus in everything that we are and everything that we do. So be with us, inspire us in this learning today as we listen to the words that are offered. We love you, we praise you, and we lift this prayer this morning to open the session in the name of your Son, our Lord and Savior, Jesus. Amen. So I'm going to do a little bit of something, kind of a little bit of an add-on. We talked about mysticism strictly. I've talked about mystics and some of the early mystics, not all of them by any stretch of the imagination. I already did the conclusion of this because, as you remember, a couple of weeks ago, I skipped one session and just went ahead and finished up. But and basically, what I was trying to say is there is an importance in the balance of the spiritual life. If you rely too heavily on your head, you may need to pray. More intention in your life of prayer, lest you end up with the religion of form, your head, without one of power that includes your heart. And a lot of that comes from Paul's teaching to Timothy in 2 Timothy 3:5. But if you get caught up on the other hand and neglect the intellectual, social, or institutional aspects of it, you may burn out, consuming all your spiritual energy in seeking spiritual heights. So if all you're doing is sitting here and trying to figure out my connection and spending time, and you may lose the other portion of things. So it really is not one being more important than the other, but the two coming together in balance and joiner together for you to have a more balanced and a better life as a Christian and as a Lutheran. But I want to tie that in because we have just talked about mysticism to give you an idea of another connection of mysticism, and that would be something that's loosely called prophetic mysticism. And we have an example of someone who was relatively recent, lived in the 20th century, Simone Weil, who is an example and an edifying and brilliant one of a Christian who embodied both the mystical and prophetic elements of the faith. In her ideas, we see glimpses of the importance of justice, and her life fully discloses its complete meaning. She had a passion for truth and justice and can ignite a spark in her hearts. As I said, she was French. She lived from like 1909 to 1943. Some people who look at her early life say, well, she was a communist and blah, 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 and so therefore we're going to discount her. But she came to a point, and there was a time of transformation in her life that puts her in the forefront of the prophetic mysticism that we're going to talk about today, and truly a true and rich and Christian life. And oh, by the way, she was born a Jew. Just to give you an idea that this can happen. We talk about bringing Christ to others and how it happens. Well, here's someone who was a Jew, but her studies, her intellect, her communication, what she did, which I think you'll find interesting, and how she put together all of her thought and whatnot, she came to the conclusion that she wanted to be a Christian. So this may be a path for us to follow with others that we know who are not part of the group, so to speak, who are not Christians. Susan Sontag describes our age as stained by the nightmare of history. It is fragmented, broken, and deafened by contradictory historical and intellectual experiences. If the term, which people use about where we are right now, post-modern, has any meaning for us, it is precisely that the celebrations of reason, confidence in human achievement, and belief in progress have all collapsed. Modern history is filled with too much ambiguity, and our globe is brimming with too much poverty and violence for us to remain untroubled and naively sanguine. In other words, just peaceful and untroubled about everything that's going on around us. No wonder then that the voices we most appreciate and cherish and actually look for, I think, are the countercultural ones, those prophetic voices that disrupt our complacency and triumphal confidence, the voices of mystics and prophets, of the marginal and afflicted, become for many of us, even when regarded as mad and neurotic, which is what she was described at times, the voices of wisdom and truth. If madness looms over mystics and prophets, these figures also expose the madness of reason and the insanity of much of our politics, our economics, and our social lives. After all, voices of madness, as Michael Foucault once argued, can be more visionary, real, and lucid than many of the most reasonable of our philosophers and scientists. Ours is an age, wrote Sontag, which consciously pursues health and yet only believes in the reality of sickness. The truths we respect are born of affliction. We measure truth in the terms of the cost to the writer in suffering, rather than by the standard of an objective truth to which a writer's words correspond. Each of our truths must have a martyr. Sontag penned these words with direct reference to our character today, Simone. Christian mysticism, it is said, is the preparation for, the consciousness of, and the reaction to the immediate or direct presence of God. Mystics describe this intense consciousness in various ways, but agree on the immediacy with which they experience God. Now, one can question Simone Weil's sanity. She was extreme in many of her convictions and judgments. She espoused and practiced an extreme of body denial. She was uncompromising in her hatred of Roman civilization and aspects of Judaism, and she spurned any philosophy of happiness or pleasure. And if you think about it, there's a lot of insanity in that. No one can doubt, on the other hand, her sacrifices on behalf of truth, her pursuit of a wisdom born of suffering, her passion for spiritual truth, and her devotion to justice. Sound like anybody we know? Okay. Weil sought to live the philosophical life with intensity and depth, integrity and compassion. Her vision of philosophy is in accord with the ancient import of the word, love of wisdom. The modern separation between theory and practice, or reason and spirituality, struck her, as it would most ancient philosophers, as a peculiar and distorted understanding of the meaning of philosophy. She sought to embody and practice the philosophical life. Philosophy was a spiritual discipline for her, not just an intellectual discipline. It is for this reason that Weil's life and thought have attracted people for so many years. Her life is as unique and extraordinary, brilliant and mysterious as her philosophical and theological thought. I think most of us want the guidance of not only great thinkers, if you think about it, we really do, but also those who have lived fully and authentically, with intensity, with love and justice. Those are people we all look up to. If you think about it in our lives, the Gandhis, the Mother Teresas, those people who live that kind of a life with authenticity, intensity, love, and justice. There's indeed a particular appeal about intellectuals who offer more than theories of justice or truth, but who provide us with hints and suggestions on how we are to live our lives. If their lives offer us glimpses of the import of justice, their examples can be gifts that unveil and more fully disclose its complete meaning. It is the union of their ideas with their lives, their daring and uncompromising passion for truth and justice, which has the potential to spark or ignite a spark in our hearts today and beyond. And I forgot to bring up the chat, and it looks like Kay has said something. I have a Jewish friend who also became a Christian as a Messianic Jew. Yes, that's true. And y'all here have a former Catholic who became a Jew in practice for 30 years who became a Christian. So it does happen. Mystics and prophets. Mystics and prophets kind of really are countercultural. They challenge the norms of their time and transgress, the border of the reasonable and predictable, of normal and ordinary. Their pronouncements and judgments are startling and they are disturbing. Think here of Isaiah and Jeremiah and Daniel and all the prophets of the Old Testament, and think about the prophets of the New Testament that we don't necessarily look at who have prophetic vision. John in Revelation, Paul in all of his writings. Okay, so they are there and they speak truth. Few wanted to hear, and they communicate realities that few can understand. Like in the Old Testament, Jerusalem is going to be gone and you're going to be scattered to the four corners of the earth. Who wanted to hear that? I'm comfortable with my home. I don't want to be scared of the four corners of the earth. And yet that was coming from God, and they were expressing their connection and their understanding of it. So we don't necessarily want to hear what prophets have to say. That doesn't make any difference. They're still there for us to listen to. No wonder they often are considered mad and are shunned and persecuted. And you can think about any of the prophets that I just mentioned. If mystics and prophets share these commonalities, there are characteristics that distinguish these two figures from one another. Christian mysticism, for the sake of a definition, is a form of spirituality that concerns the preparation for, the consciousness of, and the reaction to the immediate or direct presence of God. Okay? And I've actually repeated that twice, once in the intro for this, but also here again. So spirituality that concerns preparation for, consciousness of, and reaction to the immediate or direct presence of God. Though mystics describe this intense consciousness in various ways as vision or union with God or the cosmos, a picture that we have on the screen, deification, ecstasy and rapture, auditory communication, otherworldly journeys, birth of the word and the soul, and so on, because this is how they come in contact with God. They agree on the sense of immediacy with which they experience God. It isn't, I'm going to meet God at 1:30 down on the corner. God is there right then and right now. Of course, some biblical prophets also experience God in a direct manner. Think about Ezekiel's vision of that chariot, Isaiah's vision of God in the temple. What distinguishes the prophet from the mystic, however, is the prophet's emphasis on proclaiming the word of God usually by rebuking the sins of a particular community or particular individuals. Even if it is overstated that ethics is the key element of their message, it is not wrong to interpret the prophets as passionate in their concern for the poor and the oppressed, for widows and orphans, for strangers and aliens. An ethics of justice pervades their proclamations. And you can go and check out any prophet in New or Old Testament, and you will find that to be a reality. Mystics, by contrast, may seem to be preoccupied with what may be ahistorical realities and otherworldly truths. Ascetics, rather than ethics, or concerned with beauty rather than with moral goodness, is prominent in their lives. Many of the great mystics taught a nature-oriented and liturgical form of theology. They encountered the face of God in beauty, grandeur, and the mystery of the cosmos. The prophets regarded this with suspicion, lurking behind the reverence felt for nature or beauty. They warned as a demon of idolatry. If you're looking for God, look here in the face of the other, in the face of the hungry and the needy. Beware of your reverence for this particular mountain, this tree, this rock. Fidelity to God of history, to the God revealed through the sacred book and revealed through the events and circumstances of the nation Israel, will not be discerned or read in the book of nature. Unknown gods lie beneath rocks and trees. So the question is how prophets viewed the mystics and what they were doing, and how mystics viewed the prophets and what they were doing. So you had to hear that in what I just gave to you. Mystics are not bad unless their visions become their God. Nature becomes their God, okay? As opposed to finding God within that nature and how God is speaking to them at that point in time, because God speaks to us in our prayer life, in our life with him, in ways that we can hear and we can understand. So it may not be a burning bush or the appearance of an angel. It may be in the face of the voice of somebody else, but God speaks to us always. So we have to take that in as we listen to these words and as we take them into our hearts. Though there are real difference between mystics and prophets, most of us recognize a need for both. And we do need both. We need the prophets, we need the mystical. Even if we are attracted more by one tradition, we can see the wisdom that the other one offers. Sparked by a comment by the theologian David Tracy, that one major task of the contemporary theology is to interpret the hyphen in the term mystical hyphen prophetic. I've been attracted to thinkers that represent both elements of the Christian tradition, the mystical and the prophetic. I see the need for the mystical around me, all around me, with those who have been students, with those who have an insatiable quest for spiritual fulfillment, and in the appreciation and reverence for beauty that's manifest in nature, in art, in liturgy and ritual, or music and dance. I see the wisdom of many mystics in their brilliant philosophical illuminations concerning not only the possibilities, but also the limits of language when speaking of the divine reality, or what Master Eichert, who we talked about last time, called God beyond God. I recognize the truth of the mystic celebration of love as being sensual, erotic, and agapic. The prophets, on the other hand, remind me of the needs of the dispossessed, the disenfranchised. Love without justice, they insist, is too cheap and sentimental, too emotional and individualistic. They do not let me forget that God is present in the events of history and the exigencies of society, and that I must be vigilant to respond to God in the concrete circumstances of life. Biblical prophets teach a hard truth. that God is manifest in the lives of the afflicted and oppressed, and that wisdom is not merely the fruit of learning, but a knowledge born of suffering. So we see that I think that there is a real need for both the prophetic and in our lives, and also for the mystic. And so that's why I'm presenting to you one whose life sort of joined the both together today. Fortunately, in the life and thought of Simone, we have an example, an edifying and brilliant one at that, of a Christian, I'm going to just define her as that, who embodied both the mystical and the prophetic elements of the faith. She helps us to make sense of the hyphen that connects the two of those together, the mystical prophetic traditions. Her life and philosophy, I think, resonated for me for many reasons, but one dimension of her life is especially captivating: her brilliant intellectual achievements. I always look at people and say, wow, I am so inept. I was going to use another word, but I'm inept and unable to come up with these things, but it's incredible to read and understand and look at the achievements of others in that way, that you can sense the real connection that they have. But that those intellectual achievements joined with a commitment to, for her, manual labor, especially factory work. Not only did she study the working conditions in the 20s and 30s, the period in which she lived, she also entered the factories to experience firsthand the life of a worker in France. Are her reflections on the conditions of factory work still relevant today? Well, given the many changes in industrial capitalism since the early 20th century, probably most people would say not, but I think they are very relevant because of the increasingly oppressive and exploitive working conditions in factories in developing countries. She anticipated the concerns that many are expressing now about sweatshop labor in Latin America and Asia, and an increasing number of US companies that are moving their enterprises and moving them across the borders in order to avoid paying livable wages, to avoid decent and safe work conditions, and to escape environmental restrictions. So that's why I think her insights and her insight with understanding is truly prophetic. Make no mistake about it, she was a great intellectual, not simply an activist. She was an intellectual, however, who discerned with great lucidity and passion the shortcomings of the academic life that she lived. When she wrote Intellectual, a bad name, but we deserve it, she stated nicely her ambivalence toward her undeniable intellectual gifts and interests. Now, Gustavo Gutierrez, who many call a liberation theologian for our time, is another intellectual in this vein, an academic who finds much that is abstract and unreal and trite about the self-contained ideas of the academic community. We all heard about those white towers when we were going through school at some point in our time, or in readings that we've had. Well, that's what they're talking about. Those people who live in white towers and don't get out and do anything. In both of their cases, the world of ideas is only legitimate if it thoughtfully articulates the experiences and struggles of the poor and afflicted and inspires solidarity with such communities and histories. A quote from her: "Today it is not nearly enough merely to be a saint, but we must have the saintliness demanded by the present moment. The world needs saints," she said, "who have genius, just as a plague-stricken town needs doctors." When she says that a new saintliness is required in our time, she has in mind the need for sages who are capable of addressing in thought and action, not just thought, not just words, but action, the problems and injustices of our world. At the age of 17, okay, now think back, that would have been 1926. At the age of 17, when most women did not have any position or place, she wrote an article on the story that Alexander the Great, while crossing the desert with his army, poured out his allotment of water in order to share his soldiers' suffering. Her comments on the story foreshadowed her entire life from there forward because she wrote, his wealth being, if he had drunk the water, would have separated him from his soldiers. Sacrifice is the acceptance of pain, the refusal to obey the animal in oneself, and the will to redeem suffering men through voluntary suffering. Every saint has poured out the water. Every saint has rejected his own personal well-being that would separate him from the suffering of other men. So what she was trying to say with that story of Alexander is he became one with them. He suffered with them. Not only was he great, but he also understood the suffering and the sharing of the suffering, which made him, in my eyes, even greater. A few years later, while she was preparing to take an entrance exam for the prestigious École Normale Supérieure, she was approached by the young Simone de Beauvoir, can't pronounce his name, I'm sorry, who was fascinated by the reputation of Ville's intelligent, ascetic appearance and sensitivity to others' suffering. Apparently, some students had found her weeping for famine victims in China. Now, during their conversation, she proclaimed that the only thing that mattered was the revolution that would feed all the starving people on earth. The response was that the problem is to find the reason for human existence. Looking her up and down, Wheel retorted, it's easy to see that you've never gone hungry. It's clear that Wheel, despite being born into a privileged family, was determined from her youth to know what it is like to suffer in body and spirit. Can we think about any other mystics that we might know about who did that? Wealthy, tossed it all aside?
Good old Francis.
Good old Francis and Clare.
Yep.
Okay.
And it's interesting, Pastor. I just wanted to say that whole prophetic versus mystical thing you were talking about, is it kind of like setting up the dichotomy between grace and works? Because the prophet's sort of like, you got to get off and do stuff because I've told you this, but the mystic says, I just need to dwell in the presence of God.
Right.
I don't know. It just kind of hit me that way.
Which is why for some, like the Center for Action and Contemplation, action is an important part of contemplation. So it is kind of a joinder of that hyphen for us. Her education was exceptional. She became a student at the age of 16 of the distinguished philosopher Elaine. 3 years later, she had the highest score on that entrance exam that I mentioned, where she had the interaction with Simone at the École Normale Supérieure, with the second highest score going to the person that came to see her, Simone de Beauvoir. At the École Normale, she began reading Marx. This is where things started going downhill. Cages wrote, contemplation and listening to God leads us to action to do God's work. Thank you. Well said. She began reading Marx and dedicated herself to issues pertaining to working classes, the poor, and the cause of France's union. By the age of 21, she had finished her thesis on science of perception in Descartes and had begun teaching philosophy to young girls. She herself was young at this time, but in the city of the truth. The world needs saints who have genius, just as a plague-stricken town needs doctors. Another thing that I had inserted before, she warned. We need sages who are capable of addressing in thought and action the injustice of the world. So while she was at that city teaching those girls philosophy, she allied herself with the unemployed and led a demonstration before the city council. Her concern with the issue of colonialism was also strongly ignited at this time. After reading an article on the condition of France's colonies, she remarked that she could hardly bear the description of the condition of the Indo-Chinese. their wretchedness and enslavement, the perennially punished insolence of the whites. Her activism in the community of the Pew displeased the school's administrators, and soon she was convinced that hard physical work was essential for an intellectual. Another writer, Robert Coles, wrote, "Lest the mind become all too taken with itself, all too removed from the concrete realities of everyday life, the burdens that rest upon the overwhelming majority of the Earth's population." Well, she transferred to Auxerre. Her term did not last long there either, because she refused to teach her students the kind of rote learning the school expected. Think here about those that you know who are teachers who have to follow state mandated curriculums that don't really teach anybody anything. Side comment, sorry, but a political one. By 1933, she was teaching again in Rouen. She participated in a major event on behalf of miners and the unemployed called the March of the Miners, which only confirmed her growing reputation as a dangerous leftist. She continued to struggle during this period to clarify the direction of her life. Would she be an intellectual or would she be an activist? This is when, following neither a purely intellectual nor political activist vocation, she decided to work in a factory to truly get that firsthand experience of the daily working poor. She was forced to think that where theoretical thought could not find a solution, actual contact with the object might suggest a way out. Her biographer, Simone Petremont, writes of Wheel's decision, "The object was the misery for which remedies had to be found. If she herself plunged into this misery, she would be able to see more clearly what remedies were appropriate to it." Another biographer of her, Robert Coles, explains the significance of this decision to enter the factory. She was convinced that hard physical work was essential for an intellectual, lest the mind become all too taken with itself, all too removed from the concrete realities of everyday life, the burdens that rest upon the overwhelming majority of the Earth's population. She recognized the limits of pure theory and the necessity of committed action in history and society. In 1935, okay, several years before she died, about 8, she took up work on the assembly line in the Renault automobile factory. In addition to the physical pain and exhaustion that she endured while working there, she suffered severe migraine headaches. Her parents convinced her, because of her worn out condition, to join them on a vacation in Portugal. Remember, she still had that money family that she came from. Well, she went. In a small village, on the day of the festival of its patron saint, the conviction was born in her that Christianity is a religion of slaves, and she could not help but being one of them. The simple faith of the lowly, in this case, the peasants of this Portuguese village, imparts a wisdom that is born from their experiential contact with suffering, a wisdom inaccessible to many of the privileged of the world. The outcasts and the poor are bearers of truths about God, the human condition, and even nature, that, in the words of the Apostle Paul, shame the powerful and wise of the world. You find those words in 1 Corinthians 1:26. Love bade me welcome. Think about those words as I go further. Prior to this, there had been a notable absence of any clear interest by Wheel in Christianity, or quite frankly, in religion at all. She was raised in a secular Jewish home and was not exposed to any regular form of worship or religious belief. Her education, shaped by the classics of the Western thought, from Greek tragedy and philosophy to Descartes and Marx, did not have a religious focus. She didn't have that at all. Though she had not ignored the question of God, in fact, she took it up in that thesis that she wrote that I mentioned on Descartes. It is striking that in her early writings, Wheel considered God to be an object of intellectual abstraction, an omnipotent being who is the source of the power of the mind. The God about whom she spoke after her time with the peasants in Portugal was quite different. She described God as the good. Her experience in Portugal then represents a turning of her soul that profoundly marked the direction of her life from there on. And it's that turning that a lot of people who attack her refuse to acknowledge or see or read about. So in 37 or 38, she had more intense experiences of God. She writes that, and here's a town you've heard of before, not too long ago, as a matter of fact, in Assisi, Italy in 1937, something compelled her for the first time in her life to go down on her knees. In Solomons in 1938, she witnessed the liturgical celebration from Palm Sunday to Easter, that moving time in our church tradition. She describes the beauty of these celebrations, the music, the ritual, the church architecture, as filling her with pure joy. This truly is the eyes of an outsider coming into a Christian situation. During this time, she met a young English Catholic who introduced her to the metaphysical poets of the 17th century. She embraced this poem, the well-known Love 3 by George Herbert, with a passion, and listened to these words. Love bade me welcome, yet my soul drew back guilty of dust and sin. But quickly, love, observing me grow slack from my first entrance in, drew near to me, sweetly questioning if I lacked anything. A guest, I answered, worthy to be here. Love said, you should be here. I, the unkindled, ungrateful, my desire, I cannot look on thee. Love took my hand and smiling did reply, who made the eyes but I? Truth, Lord, but I have marred them. Let my shame go where it doth deserve. And yet, know you not, says love, who bore the blame? My dear, then I will serve. You must sit down, says love, and taste my meat. So I did sit down and I did eat. She made herself meditate on this poem during her violent headaches. I used to think I was reciting it as a beautiful poem she wrote, but without my knowing it, the recitation had the virtue of a prayer. It was during one of these recitations, as I told you, Christ himself came down and took possession of me. Wheel later explains that God had prevented her from reading the mystics so that, given her critical and skeptical mind, it should be evident to her that she had not invented this completely unexpected contact. In other words, if she had studied mysticism as a kid up through the time that she had these experiences, she would have questioned them intellectually because she was first and foremost an intellect. And she wouldn't have understood what was going on, but would have questioned it. Nah, that can't be the truth. That's because I ate chocolate before I went to bed, or whatever other excuses you use for the dreams that you have. The implications of this spiritual transformation in the life of Simone Weil were profound, but one potential implication certainly did not follow, namely an abandonment of her commitment to social justice. Hers was not a dualistic spirituality. Her concern for addressing the material needs of the human spirit, it was just as passionate as before her religious transformation. Only now, it was more consciously related to an awareness of the presence of the crucified Christ in the faces of the afflicted. Her involvement in the Young Christian Workers Movement illustrates her interest in imbuing social and political reform with a Christian spirit. It's quite clear that her nascent mystical consciousness only intensified and deepened her attention to the invisible and powerless of history and society. So we'll talk about how she may have been viewed here for a little bit. Given this incredibly powerful interest in Christianity and Roman Catholicism in particular, why is it she refused to be baptized? Her answer to that question is a further instance of the strength of her convictions. She tells us that her love of non-Christian traditions and spiritualities from Greece, Egypt, India, and China kept her from entering the church. Given the negative attitude of the institutional pre-Vatican II church toward world religions and secular tradition, she felt that a decision to enter the church would signify a betrayal of the wisdom and truth that lies outside of the church. This fidelity reveals her desire to be in solidarity not only with the European traditions of Christianity, but to embrace the histories and cultures of non-European people, all the countries inhabited by colored races, in her words. Thus, while Wheel confesses that she loves God, Christ, and the Catholic faith, she understood her vocation to be one in exile from the church, to be a witness to the truth of Christ wherever she discerned truth to exist. The list of figures who have been inspired by her is quite intensive. Albert Camus thought that her essays on Marx on social and political themes, collected under the title Oppression and Liberty, were more penetrating and more prophetic than anything since Marx. In his introduction to Wheels, The Need for Roots, poet T.S. Eliot remarked, "We must simply expose ourselves to the personality of a woman of genius, of a kind of genius akin to that of the saints." Pope John the 23rd, who convened the Second Vatican Council, mentioned her as a significant influence on the development of his thought. Such testimonies by very different individuals suggest the breadth and the complexity of her thought. Not all responses to her life, though, were affirmative. Charles de Gaulle didn't mince words. "She's out of her mind." George Bataille called her with disgust the Christian, and in The Blue Sky describes the following way a character he modeled on her. "She wore black, ill-fitting, dirty clothes. I felt that such an existence would only have sense for men and a world doomed to misfortune." Perhaps Wheel would have conceded that her existence is unintelligible in a world devoid of affliction and misfortune. But tragically, these are all too real in the time and space we all inhabit. In her own perspective, the suffering of the world, the mark of slavery, and the mark of the cross had entered into her person and contributed to the construction of her unique and transgressive identity. The relevance of Wheel has never been greater, I think. She's precisely the type of thinker that we should pick up and read as we embark on this century, because she helpfully combines perspectives that we hold apart in unhealthy separation, such as mysticism and prophetic thought, spirituality and politics, theory and practice. And in her books, quite frankly, they are very readable. Her writing, like her way of life, is direct, and it's honest, and it's unsentimental, and it's precise, and it's bare. In this light, her close friend, Gustave Thibon, expresses the unity of theory and practice, form and content, and mysticism and prophecy of her life. She did not write one line which was not the exactest possible expression of an irresistible inspiration, and at the same time, an invitation and an engagement to remain faithful to this inspiration, to embody in her whole life and to the very depths of her being what her spirit had glimpsed. And that, my friends, is your introduction to Simone Weil. Questions? And if you have none, I'd be surprised. Comments?
I think I missed some of it because I can't hear real well. I have a fan going in here, but can you spell her name, please?
Simone, capital Weil. And I went back and forth from Wheel to Veal, depending, only because if her heritage was truly Jewish, it probably was a V to pronounce it, a W to spell.
And where was she from?
France.
France. Did she live most of her life there?
I'm sorry?
Did she live her life in France?
Most of her life, yeah, most of her life was lived in France. She had traveled, and she saw other things in other places. Most of her life was lived in France. Her experience of God that she described for the transformation to Christianity happened in Portugal, but she also spent time in China and other places in the world. So yeah, she was around.
And she never joined any faith at all. She just studied it all.
She
No.
got baptized, didn't she, at the end of her life, I think, when she was dying of tuberculosis.
Okay, yes, when she
Yeah.
was dead.
Yeah. Like Constantine.
Yeah, okay.
They get baptized at the end because they say, well, now I can embrace it. Constantine said you couldn't be a good emperor and a good Christian at the same time.
Right, exactly.
So, but she was interesting too, because I know she challenged Leon Trotsky, and people were always arguing, she was such a communist and a Marxist, but she started to get very disillusioned with that philosophy because she was, anti-fascism, which, anybody, if you're anti-authoritarianism and oppression, that makes sense. But at that time, she got caught up in that whole political movement. But then she started to realize that those folks were just as oppressive as the people they were fighting. They were just taking on a new label and saying they were doing it in the name of the workers, and they really weren't. And she was one of the few people that could challenge some of those communist and Marxist leaders. So she spoke truth to power. And as a woman, that was hard to do, especially then.
In that era. Yep.
Yeah. Yeah.
In any era.
Yeah.
What-
But it is easier for us now, it's a little bit more acceptable, but yeah, she was something.
So she concludes my initial prepared thoughts on Christianity and mysticism. I did want to give you that connection though, because I think it's important with the prophetic and the mysticism and bringing them together. And maybe it's not as much as a hyphen, which indicates a separation, but a slash, which indicates a joinder for us to kind of look at and think about, pray about, and perhaps even model in our lives. So my friends, thank you for joining us on Zoom today. Next week when we gather, hang on to this link that you clicked onto. If you want to join us on Zoom next week, that's fine and dandy. I will be in person at the church, which means I got to get fully dressed and brush my teeth. No, I'm kidding. But yeah, I'll be at the church and we will offer this both on Zoom and in person. All right. God bless each of you. Thank you for joining us today.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you for giving us a lot to think about again.
Well, that's the whole idea. I don't want to
Amen.
be easy for you. That's why I don't, and in this kind of a course, it's why I don't give you a lot of study sheets.
Yeah.
Be more looking at the study sheet and less listening to what might be a moment of opaqueness turned to translucence for you in your life. So
Thank you.
God bless. Thanks for joining.
Thanks, Pastor.
Thank you.
Oh, wait.